After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan's forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. In just a few months, they captured territories, bases, and resources from the Philippines to Malaya and beyond. The American Pacific Fleet, badly damaged at Pearl Harbor, had to rebuild quickly. Battleships would take time to repair or replace, so aircraft carriers became the main striking arm in the early months of 1942. In April 1942, a small force of American bombers launched from a carrier struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The Doolittle raid caused limited damage, but showed that the Japanese home islands were not completely safe. In May 1942, Japanese and American carriers clashed in the Coral Sea. It was the first battle in history where opposing ships never saw each other, fighting entirely with aircraft. Coral Sea ended in a kind of draw, with losses on both sides, but it stopped a Japanese advance toward Port Moresby and taught both navies lessons about carrier tactics and coordination. Despite setbacks, Japanese leaders still hoped to destroy the remaining U.S. carriers in a single decisive battle, similar to how they had once viewed big battleship clashes. They chose Midway Atoll, a tiny American outpost northwest of Hawaii, as the bait. Capturing Midway would threaten Hawaii and hopefully lure out the U.S. carriers to be ambushed. As spring 1942 ended, both Japan and the United States were rebuilding, training, and planning. The next major clash would test everything they had learned about carrier warfare. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, designed a complex plan to draw the U.S. fleet into battle near Midway. Multiple task forces would operate over a huge area of ocean. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would lead the main carrier striking force, including the powerful carriers Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, the same ships that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Another part of the plan involved attacks in the Aleutian Islands in the far north, meant to distract and confuse American commanders about where the main blow would fall. The plan depended on surprising the U.S. carriers, just as at Pearl Harbor. Japanese leaders believed that American codebreakers could not know all the details and that their forces would appear suddenly near Midway. Japanese planners assumed that the U.S. had only a few operational carriers and that some were still badly shaken from earlier battles. They expected the Americans to react cautiously and predictably. By threatening Midway, Japan hoped to force the U.S. to fight on Japan's terms. They expected American admirals to rush to defend the outpost and walk straight into a powerful trap. To work, the plan required careful timing and radio discipline across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Different groups had to move in sync without giving away their positions. On paper, the operation seemed impressive, but it scattered Japanese forces, underestimated enemy intelligence, and assumed that surprise would work as well as it had in 1941. In a basement in Hawaii, U.S. Navy codebreakers at Station HYPO sifted through streams of intercepted Japanese radio messages, trying to decode their plans. The codebreakers suspected that a location called AF in Japanese messages was actually Midway. To test this, Midway was told to send an unencrypted report about a water shortage. Soon, Japanese messages mentioned AF having water problems. With growing confidence, the codebreakers told Admiral Nimitz that Japan planned to attack Midway and roughly when it would happen. This gave the U.S. a chance to prepare an ambush of their own. Nimitz decided not to abandon Midway. Instead, he would reinforce it and send his carriers to lie in wait northeast of the atoll, hoping to surprise the Japanese as they approached. The U.S. had 3 carriers available for the battle: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Crews were tired from earlier operations, but they knew how important the next fight would be. On Midway itself, Marines, air crews, and ground staff prepared defenses. Runways were lined with bombers, fighters, and patrol planes, and gun positions were dug around the small atoll. On the American carriers, Admiral Raymond Spruance and other leaders briefed pilots and crews on what to expect. They would rely on good scouting, careful timing, and a measure of luck. Thanks to codebreaking, Nimitz knew more about the enemy plan than the enemy knew about his. The stage was set for a rare moment in history, a side waiting in ambush for an attacker who believed he had the surprise. Japanese carrier groups slipped out of home waters, keeping radio silence as much as possible. Nagumo's force headed east across the Pacific toward Midway, believing they were undetected. The American carriers, including the repaired Yorktown, took up positions northeast of Midway. Spruance aimed to keep his ships hidden while still close enough to strike when the time came. Both sides relied on scout planes to find the other first. Midway-based patrol planes and carrier scouts fanned out across the ocean, searching wide arcs for any sign of enemy ships. Cloud banks and changing weather made scouting more difficult. Some areas were shrouded, while other sectors were clear, adding an element of chance to who would spot whom first. Midway's patrol planes reported contact with parts of the Japanese force. These early reports were not perfect, but they told American commanders that the enemy was near and moving toward the atoll. On the carriers, pilots waited in their ready rooms, checking gear and reviewing target photos. Deck crews prepared aircraft with bombs and torpedoes, knowing that any strike might decide the battle. Nagumo planned to strike Midway first, knocking out its airfields and then be ready to counter any American carriers that appeared. His decks were loaded with aircraft prepared mainly for attacking the island. By early June, both fleets were in position. Neither side knew exactly where the other carriers were yet, but both understood that the next few days could change the balance of the entire war in the Pacific. On June 4, 1942, dawn broke over Midway as a mostly ordinary morning. Ground crews checked aircraft, radar operators scanned the skies, and Marines manned defenses around the small atoll. Soon, Midway's radar screen showed incoming aircraft. Operators warned the island that a large formation was headed their way, the Japanese strike launched by Nagumo. Midway's fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes scrambled into the air to intercept the incoming attack and to try to locate the Japanese carriers for counterstrikes. Japanese bombers and fighters swooped down on Midway, bombing runways, fuel tanks, and facilities. Defenders fired back with anti-aircraft guns, trying to damage the attackers and protect key assets. The raid damaged Midway, but did not destroy its ability to operate. Some aircraft and defenses remained, and observers reported the direction from which the Japanese strike had come. Nagumo now faced a difficult choice: launch a second strike on Midway or rearm his planes with weapons suited to attack any American carriers that might be nearby. Reports from scouts were incomplete and confusing. On Japanese carriers, crews began to rearm aircraft for a possible anti-ship mission. Bombs and torpedoes were moved in hangars and on decks, creating a crowded, flammable environment just below the surface of the calm sea. Meanwhile, American carriers tracked reports and prepared their own strike groups. Spruance Wade went to launch, knowing that striking too early or too late could mean missing the enemy or arriving uncoordinated. By mid-morning on June 4th, both sides had launched and recovered waves of aircraft. Scouts still searched, commanders still debated, and the moment when carriers would find each other drew closer with every minute. American scout planes and strike groups searched wide areas, often without perfect coordinates. Pilots scanned endless stretches of ocean, hoping for a glimpse of wakes or smoke. U.S. torpedo squadrons from the carriers attacked first, flying low and straight at the Japanese carriers. They faced fierce anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition, and suffered heavy losses. Although most of the torpedo planes were shot down, their crews pressed home their attacks. Their courage drew Japanese fighters and distracted defenses at a critical moment. While Japanese defenses focused low, U.S. dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived high above. Guided by last-minute sightings, they spotted Nagumo's carriers largely unprotected from the air. In a few dramatic minutes, U.S. dive bombers plunged down on the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū. Bombs struck decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, starting uncontrollable fires and explosions. Nagumo's main striking power was shattered. In a very short time, 3 of his 4 carriers were mortally damaged, changing the course of the battle in favor of the United States. Aircraft from Yorktown also played a key role, contributing to the damage on the Japanese carriers. The repaired ship, barely back from earlier battles, now helped turn the tide off Midway. On the damaged Japanese carriers, firefighting teams worked desperately, but the combination of bombs, fuel, and ammunition proved too much. One by one, Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū became blazing wrecks. In just a few attacks, the balance of power flipped. At the start of the day, Japan had more carriers at Midway. By midday, the United States held the advantage at sea. One Japanese carrier, Hiryū, remained operational after the first American strikes. Admiral Yamamoto decided to launch counterattacks immediately, hoping to even the score before nightfall. Hiryū's aircraft found and attacked Yorktown, scoring bomb and torpedo hits. The American carrier was badly damaged, shuddering under explosions and fires. Yorktown's crew fought the damage with impressive discipline. For a time, they brought fires under control and stabilized the ship, demonstrating how vital damage control training could be. A second strike from Hiryū hit Yorktown again. The damage mounted and eventually the carrier had to be abandoned, though many of her crew survived and transferred to other ships. American scouts searched for the remaining Japanese carrier. Reports gradually narrowed down Hiryū's position, allowing U.S. commanders to plan a retaliatory strike. Later in the day, U.S. dive bombers located Hiryū and attacked. Bombs struck her flight deck and island, starting large fires and crippling her ability to launch or recover aircraft. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard Hiryū as she burned and later sank, sharing the fate of many in his crew. His decision became part of the story of dedication and loss in the battle. Yorktown, though saved at first, was later struck again by torpedoes from a Japanese submarine while under tow. She eventually sank, another reminder that even damaged ships remained targets. By the end of June 4th, most of Japan's carrier striking power at Midway lay beneath the sea or was beyond use, while the U.S. still had operational ships. The 4 days around Midway were tipping sharply toward an American victory. When the fighting ended, Japan had lost 4 frontline carriers and many experienced pilots. The United States had lost Yorktown and aircraft, but retained carriers and a growing industrial base. Beyond the ships themselves, Japan lost many of its best carrier pilots and crew members. Replacing experienced air crews proved much harder than building new aircraft. The United States could call on enormous shipbuilding and aircraft production. Over time, new carriers and planes would replace losses and expand the fleet, while Japan struggled to keep up. Nimitz's decision to trust his codebreakers and set an ambush at Midway paid off. The battle turned a risky defense into one of the most significant strategic victories of the war. Japanese leaders had to rethink their plans after Midway. The idea of easily drawing out and destroying the U.S. carriers had failed, and the balance of initiative began to shift toward the Allies. In the United States, news of Midway boosted morale by showing that Japan could be defeated at sea. In Japan, the full details of the loss were kept quiet at first, but those in the Navy knew how serious it was. After Midway, the U.S. and its allies gradually moved from a mainly defensive posture to more offensive operations in the Pacific, including the Guadalcanal campaign later in 1942. Midway is often called a turning point in the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy would still fight fierce battles, but it never fully regained the carrier strength and experienced air crews lost in those critical days. Historians, veterans, and students often study Midway as one of the most important naval battles in history, especially for the role of aircraft carriers and intelligence. For many years, the work of the codebreakers remained secret. Later, their role in revealing Japan's plan became a central part of the Midway story. Pilots and sailors from both sides later shared their experiences: long takeoff runs, searching empty seas, terrifying dives, and moments of teamwork and courage. Like many famous battles, Midway has gathered myths and simplified stories. Careful research helps separate dramatic legends from what really happened on those days in June 1942. Modern navies study Midway to learn about scouting, deception, coordination, and the importance of information. The basic questions of who sees whom first and who acts fastest still matter at sea. Ceremonies and memorials honor those who fought and died at Midway, on ships, in aircraft, and on the atoll. Wreaths, plaques, and moments of silence keep their memory alive. Films, novels, games, and documentaries continue to retell the story of Midway, often adding drama while introducing new generations to the core events of the battle. Our tiny admirals and pilots remind us that battles are shaped by information, choices, and people on every level, from codebreakers and commanders to deck crews and scouts. Studying Midway helps us see how fragile and powerful decision-making can be in wartime,